Welcome. Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Wayne. This is Voices for the Future, the first program of 2024. I don't remember the year, with Adadig Judith. And we're very excited and delighted to have Maren Poitras as our guest. Maren is the filmmaker behind a film that's coming out in the spring, Finding the Money. So I'll introduce Maren. Her documentary, it's her feature documentary debut, Finding the Money, world premiered at the Woodstock Film Festival 2023 and received the Audience Award for Best Feature Film at the Green Film Festival, San Francisco. It'll be widely available in the spring of this year. Maren's originally from the California Bay Area and has a background in environmental science and agriculture from UC Berkeley. And she is associate producer with Codebreaker Films on Enemies of the State, which came out in 2020, and Reality Winner 2023. And I'll just say a few things about Finding the Money, the film. The central question Finding the Money asks is this: can a new economic theory revolutionize our ability to tackle the climate crisis, wealth inequality, a substandard healthcare system, and other issues, and help create a more equitable and fair society? The film shows that an underdog group of economists is on a mission to do so and instigate a paradigm shift by flipping our understanding of the national debt and the nature of money upside down. And Finding the Money follows former chief economist to Bernie Sanders, Stephanie Kelton, on a journey through modern monetary theory, or MMT, to unveil a deeper story about money, injecting new hope and empowering democracies around the world to tackle the biggest challenges of the 21st century, from climate change to inequality. So welcome, Maren.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for your willingness. So the first thing I want to ask is just your own background and your journey to making this film and what attracted you to the subject. And you know, for many people, economics is something that just is something they tune out, but you've made it very accessible, very easy to understand, and also something that people will, that mind-bending when they understand, when they see what you're saying in what everyone is saying in the film. So anyway,
yeah. So no, I guess the spark for me was some years ago now, but like you kind of mentioned, my background is more in environmental science, and see myself more as a climate activist. And so I think I was really trying to understand these big picture questions of, you know, what are some of the root causes of climate change, and how can we, I think I realized that systemic change was needed. And so you really have to look at the roots of the systems that we live in, rather than maybe a lot of Band-Aid solutions, or what they would like to call, you know, market-based solutions to climate change, because always climate and the environment is somehow linked to the economy. You know, usually they're pitted against each other, like they're two different things. Like, you know, we can't have a healthy environment if we don't have or we can't have a healthy economy if we're not kind of trashing the environment somehow. And so I always saw a bit of a disconnect between economics and environmental studies. And so you know, one day when I'm perusing more ecological economics literature, which is where I started from more, which is not to be confused with environmental economics, two very different things. And it kind of, they raised a question or a spark around, oh, you know, how banks create money too, and they make loans. I was like, what? You know, like, wait, what? So that just kind of stopped me in my tracks and somehow led me on this circuitous path to this story about MMT. And when I finally landed on this small group of folks, they were such characters in and of themselves, and the controversy is actually what brought me in, I guess, that there was so much conflict or controversy around just what seems to be an effort to describe the monetary system that we already have today. And so my biggest question was always, how can we not, if this is a system that we have created, why is there kind of this mystery shrouding it? And there seem to be so many mysteries of how the economy works, like it's some kind of natural mysterious system that we need to placate. But long story short, the characters drew me into MMT, and the simple core of their message, which was such a reverse of what I had heard over the course of my life about the national debt and the nature of money and the way I thought of things. Especially just coming from a public policy perspective of what the federal government can afford when we're talking about enormous challenges like climate change and the Green New Deal, inequality. The first question is always, how are you going to pay for it? So if that's not the right question, then what is, and what is actually possible, and what can we do to solve these enormous challenges? Are they solvable on a scale and time frame that we had maybe given up on almost already? So I think, yeah, that kind of led me down this path. And so I just, I felt like before I could even make a film, let's say, about ecological economics and some of the paradoxes of an economy that's growing forever in material output and GDP, material throughput, before I could even talk about that, I have to understand this first very root basic assumption of what is money to begin with, and where does it come from? So I had to start there, I guess.
Well, then let's start there. What is money and where does it come from? What's the basis of the modern monetary theory? So people who are not familiar with it at all, you can tell our listeners.
Yeah. And so in the film, I kind of lay it out in chapters as well. And the first chapter is, the first point of MMT is that the federal government is the issuer of the currency. So when you think about, you always have to think about a specific currency. Let's say Warren Moser says, and I didn't fit this into the film, but something that's really stuck with me that he always says is that, he doesn't ever like to even use the word money. It's too general, it's too vague. So if you can practice being specific about what monetary instrument, what financial instrument you're speaking of, which currency are you speaking of, then it's always easier to trace where does it actually come from, and where's it going and who's holding it. Because in the film, we start to see that money, if it is issued by a government, so you can think of, any currency in the world today, there are different levels of monetary sovereignty, and we can go over that. And that's also not really able to fit in the film. So there's a much bigger world out there. But starting with the basic questions of what is money, where does it come from, in the film we lay out that it's actually the federal government in the United States, at least, that is the issuer of the US dollar. And you can track it because money always has two sides. It always is a debt of the issuer and an asset to the holder, the creditor. So that's, if you start just that basic shift of starting to think of money as an accounting tool that always has two sides, kind of always has a plus and a minus, a debt and a credit, then everything starts to shift when you're changing your story that you tell about money from being a natural object itself, like let's say gold, something you can touch and hold and dig out from the ground and is scarce itself, and natural. Then you start to change your whole conception of how the system works. But we can dive into that more.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the question that always gets asked, how are you going to pay for it? And I want to contrast that with the title of the film, Finding the Money. So what does that mean, finding the money? And how does that, and especially relative to how are you going to pay for it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the play, and it's kind of a play on words, and then it's, Stephanie's one of her main lines in the film is that, finding the money is actually the easy part. You don't have to go out and find the money. So we're shifting that paradigm from money is something you have to go out and find in nature, that the government has to go out and find just like everyone else, like it wasn't the issuer of the currency. And so it's that root story of the nature of money. Is it a commodity? Is it a physical thing? Or is it a social accounting ledger, then money isn't exactly something the federal government needs to go out and find, but throughout this story, we're kind of finding the nature of money as well in my mind. And so it's kind of an exploration, but the film is trying to kind of show that money isn't really something you can go out and find. And that's where we need to have a shift and change the way we talk about money and the national debt and what the federal government can afford. So we kind of want to replace that question maybe of how are you going to pay for it with how are you actually going to resource it? What are the real resources you really need for this project you're proposing? If it's a Green New Deal, if it's housing for all, housing, if it's healthcare, those all have different real resource needs. And so, you actually need to look into it and look into the resources your society has, how much is available, how much is currently unemployed, how much can be put, kind of put into cultivation, let's say, or increased capacity through, a thoughtful investment, public provisioning investment. Then we can start thinking about how, do we have the resources to do this project? Because if so, money is not one of those scarce resources that we need to put into that process. Money is really just the organizing tool to help facilitate the production and organization and distribution of those real resources towards a goal that we collectively have to decide.
I'm sure you dealt with that in making the film. You had to raise money to make your film. You had to find the money, right? And you had the resources, you had the people, you had the intelligence, you had the, skills. Yeah.
Yeah. Always ironic and frustrating that money is not flowing easily towards me. But whatever, so yeah, it's definitely been a very independent production and a bit of a shoestring production in itself. So yeah, we were certainly not finding a lot of money flowing towards us. But if we were the issuer of the currency, or maybe if the federal government, like some other countries, decided to fund independent film or the arts, we would be in a little better situation in terms of the diversity of stories that can be told.
Yeah. So I want to share my screen talking about money and a theme in the film always is the debt and many images from various presidents and what is always drilled in people's mind is the national debt. So these are two images. The one from top is from, I think, US Debt Clock or debtclock.org, and the bottom one, which you show in the film, this actually is ticking. I just did a screenshot. So it was a couple hours ago I did this, and the US debt was 34 trillion. And then this is the famous national debt clock in Midtown Manhattan around Bryant Park. And this was, I don't know how long ago, it was 31 trillion. So we have it drilled in our head, as I said, that the debt, is going to take us down. U.S. is broke. We can't pay for it. How are we going to pay for it? We can't do anything that'll help people. We had enhanced child tax credit for a year, but we couldn't continue that. So a central theme that gets in the film, Finding the Money, that gets keep talking about was the debt is not the question. And Stephanie Kellum wrote a best-selling book, The Deficit Myth. So I'm wondering if you could say more about that, Maren.
Yeah. And so laying it out in the film, hopefully you start to see the pieces that need to come together to get to this kind of revelation, almost as it was for myself, to really understand what the national debt clock simply represents. And it's usually portrayed as representing our debt, like the taxpayers' debt. This is a debt that us and our children and our grandchildren are going to have to pay back someday. It's just like if you take out a mortgage on a house, you have to pay that back. But just like a mortgage on a house, it also has two sides. So we find through the film, the issuer of the currency, the US dollar, the national debt simply represents, in the end, the number of dollars the federal government has created and spent into the economy and not yet taxed back. That difference is what's basically left, the money that's left circulating in the economy. It's what's left in our savings accounts. And they get typically through the accounting, we can show you, it gets transformed into Treasury Bonds today. And those Treasury Bonds build the notes we call the national debt. That accounting record. So that's really all it is. It's just an accounting record of, the history of the United States from the beginning, how many dollars have been spent and not yet taxed back that currently reside, as savings of the private sector, which is you and me, taxpayers. And that includes some foreign entities, that includes a lot of domestic entities, businesses, what have you. So it's not actually the taxpayer's debt, because as Randy often says, the taxpayer's debt is the taxes that they have to owe. The dollars, the government's debt, is the opposite. It's our asset, it's our savings, and those instruments are what we use to pay our taxes then later. So without a debt or deficit, you can conversely understand, it would be very difficult for Americans to have dollars to save in their pockets without the national debt. So we see that it's not a limit in terms of borrowing, like how much can we borrow to pay for a federal priority. It's more a limit of how much money can we create and spend without causing a inflation problem or a real resource problem or an ecological problem. So that's the limit. There's always limit we need to keep in mind, because this is, an important accounting record that we don't want to just, obviously, core message here is you can't just print and spend whatever you want and expect there to be no consequences. That's often a trope, kind of put upon MMT, but that's not, of course, what they say. They say they're very focused on the limits. When you shift from understanding the limit as how much we can borrow to how much can we spend, it is a very different way of budgeting and a very different limit. So when you talk about how the federal government should be thinking about and proposing new legislation and analyzing new legislation, today we have the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, who analyzes how much is this going to add to the debt, and then they kind of leave it there, as if it's too much, then it will be terrible. But they don't do the hard work and the necessary work of saying, what resources would this specific proposition use? And are there going to be pressure points and inflationary impacts from this spending, no matter the size of the debt or the deficit? At a certain, it does matter what that ultimate stock is, but it's very important where those flows are going, where the spending flows are going, and whether there's capacity in those specific sectors. So there's a lot of work, that the government should be doing today to be more fiscally responsible. I think once you understand from an MMT's perspective, we're not analyzing our budgetary proposals well enough. We should be analyzing them more for inflationary impact and be more concerned about inflationary impact every time the government spends, no matter whether it's paid for or not, whether it's offset by certain taxes or not. We have to be looking at the spending, and I think this enables us to be more concerned, more proactive, and more successful at preventing inflation than we would be without it.
Yeah, maybe you can explain how inflation figures into all this, because I think that is most people's objection. Oh, well, this is going to cause inflation, and then that's going to hit the average person and put them into more debt.
Exactly. Yeah. And so everyone, recognizes that we certainly don't want out of control inflation, right? And certainly MMT, it's always been very hard to get past, the first kind of maybe media representation of MMT, or the first conception that most economists who have heard of it say, oh, those are those crazy people that say you can create as much money as you want and there are no consequences and it will never cause inflation. That's, again, not quite true. So MMT will say, we really want us to focus more on inflation and be more concerned about it. So they say, inflation is the limit to government spending. And so there has been a big debate within economics now for the last couple of years since the pandemic started, and we started, to get some inflationary pressures specifically after the start of the war in Ukraine and oil prices there. And so when you look at different inflationary episodes in the US through time, we have this one, we have the last one in the 70s, and then around, the world wars, you can see, you need to look at what is causing the inflation, right? That's like the first thing we should stop and do. But economists, for some reason, don't want to stop and do that, because the only tool that they say they have, or that they say the government has to deal with inflation, is simply the Fed and its tool to raise interest rates or lower interest rates, which is known as monetary policy. It's basically this one simple tool. It's what they've got. And so, if all you have is a nail, everything looks like a hammer, right? So I think if this is your only tool to deal with it, they want to simplify the story into saying, okay, you know, it's a demand side problem. So that's maybe where the current theory that the Fed is using, that mainstream textbooks talk about, of how monetary policy, raising interest rates, can lower inflation. But the problem is, you know, we just don't see that in the real world. You know, we don't see the consequences of raising interest rates as a one-to-one relationship to lowering inflation. Now, inflation has come down, thank goodness, you know, probably in spite of the interest rate rises, because as MMT will point out, there's another side to that, where with the stock of the national debt, as we just saw, at 34 trillion, when the Fed voluntarily is deciding to raise rates from around 0 to 5%, that means effectively that the federal government is having to deficit spend, create and spend an extra $1 trillion as 5% interest on that stock of debt. So that extra $1 trillion is being created and put into someone's pocket to, you know, definitionally, the wealthier, who by definition hold the most savings, are getting the most of that deficit spending. So as Warren Mosler will say, you know, it's highly regressive. It's basically it's basically basic income but only for the rich. So it's kind of the opposite of what you would think we would want to be doing. So we're putting more money into the economy in a way through that deficit spending, through the raise in interest rates. And we're not, you know, the Fed hasn't managed to cause high unemployment, and that's what they think. Their high interest rates are supposed to bring unemployment up. It's actually supposed to kick people out of work, so that, you know, labor becomes more precarious in a way, so that they're willing to take lower wages. And so that's their theory. However, you know, unemployment has not gone up. It's remained, for whatever reason, probably through the fiscal, you know, the strong fiscal policies that were put in through COVID. We haven't seen, you know, the effects, the expected effects of higher interest rates. And indeed, the Fed itself will say, you know, they just don't have the real world evidence. They don't have the evidence. They haven't published a paper that I'm aware of that shows, you know, this causal link between interest rates and inflation. What they have now is something called inflation expectations, is their theory, that the only thing that can bring inflation down is if we expect inflation to come down. And so it's, you know, and so they're just tying themselves in these very intricate knots. And it always, to me, comes down to an understanding of what is money and where is it coming from. And then we can start to have a much better conversation about how we can deal with inflation and deal with our policy priorities. We're talking in circles if you're trying to follow mainstream economic experts, and I'm really sorry to have to say that, but yeah, it is unfortunate. And so, you know, on the flip side, MMT would say there's this whole suite of policies that we can use, that the federal government can employ to help prevent and deal with inflation, either prevent it from in the first place or deal with it once we have it, depending on what's causing it. So in the film, we go over a little bit, you know, in the pandemic caused specific, you know, shortages of goods. You know, factories were shut, and then we had a shipping backlog. And so there are very specific bottlenecks. You know, we had there was a chip shortage, you know, and that led to a huge increase in the cost of, you know, factories being shut down, a huge increase in the cost of used cars. So we saw that in the CPI index. And so that was a very specific thing, maybe even contributed to by Bitcoin as well, and a lot of chip demand. But, you know, if that's the cause of your inflation, and all of a sudden, you know, that's what's feeding the rise in prices, it's a very specific thing, or it's a very specific thing. And energy is usually where US inflation has always come from, is energy prices, oil prices. We're a very oil dependent economy, right? It kind of is the foundation the economy is built upon. And so if you're seeing a spike in energy prices, then you have to address that, because otherwise that's going to feed through. And so how do you address that? You know, in the 70s and today, it could have been the same thing. It could have been increasing supply of green renewable energy, and so that we have an alternative energy source that's domestic, that's sustainable. That kind of capacity building will bring down the need and the dependence upon oil. And frankly, it's, you know, the market prices and the OPEC controlled price on the market of oil. And so in the 70s, you know, we saw this as well, that you can either at the same time, you could try policies to decrease demand for oil, So take that demand out, but also then increase the supply of energy so that people have an alternative and an alternative public infrastructure to be able to use and not be, just forced and kind of trapped in this position where you have to pay more for energy because there are no other options. So we have to look at it collectively, I think. But yeah, I could dive into a lot more details, but this kind of stuff does start to go over people's heads, right? So I think the film is hopefully sticking as much of this juicy detail and clarification in as I can to a 90-minute introductory film.
Yeah, I think your animations in the film make it very clear, actually. Yeah, Michael. Yeah.
Yeah. So talking about again debt deficit, one of the things modern monetary theory talks about, and the film really goes into, and even has conversations with a few economists who seem to be befuddled by this idea, is that as you were talking about, Maren, the government can create its own money. The U.S. government creates dollars, and Congress creates a budget, and the government and they direct the Treasury how much money they need, but they can always find more money, find more money for paying for a war in Ukraine, or assisting Ukraine, or assisting Israel, or disaster relief, or whatever. So the question is, and also the question in the film is, if the government can create money, and as Ben Bernanke, the former head of the Federal Reserve, famously said on 60 Minutes years ago, he said, "Oh, we just create money by a few hitting the keyboard. That's all it takes, a few keys on the keyboard." Why does the government need to sell bonds? Theoretically, they call it borrowing. It's not really borrowing, but why do they if they got the money? Finding how easy it is. So
yes, no, great question. It's a terrific question, and one I always struggled with trying to fit into the film and how I could explain it. So, and most folks aren't aware even of the jargon of what is a treasury bond, right? And so it's a lot to unpack. But that's exactly the next question that you should have is why does the government need to sell bonds then in the first place? And the answer is, the simple answer, according to MMT, is that they don't. They don't need, there's no financial reason for them to have to sell bonds. It's either, it's basically a vestige from an older way things were done. And it's just current law. It's just current law that says when the federal government deficit spends, if it spends 100 in and it taxes 90 out, then it's deficit spend 10. And it says whatever you've deficit spent, you need to basically exchange those dollars for treasury bonds. You have to issue bonds for however much you've deficit spent. So they need to issue 10 in treasury bonds and pay whatever interest the Fed deems to pay on those treasury bonds. So number one, the key, so if you start from the order of things, right, like the order is the government spends cash first, basically. When the moment that the Congress decides, approves a budget spending bill, then, and it's appropriated, the funding's appropriated, that money is basically created in that moment. And when the Fed credits the accounts that Congress told it to credit, if it's paying construction workers or it's paying a defense contractor, whoever, that's when those dollars are created. And they're simply digital dollars, basically. Think of them as cash, digital cash. And so however much at the end of the year, once all the taxes come back in, however much ends up being that deficit number, let's say it's 10, they never know at the end of the year how much it's going to be. So then they have to issue treasury bonds to equal that number, basically. So those cash, which sit as a liability on the Fed's balance sheet, so, we're always thinking about where's that plus, where's that minus, where's that credit, where's that debt. So when the Fed credits accounts, like Bernanke said, that's just a keystroke. They're crediting accounts on the government's behalf. That cash, so digital cash or the cash that we use, in the paper money we have in our wallets, those all are recorded as liabilities on the Fed's balance sheet. So they're recorded there. Now, when the Treasury issues bonds, those liabilities basically move from a liability of the Fed to being a liability of the Treasury now, and which basically, the Fed and the Treasury, according to MMT, are basically one and the same. The Fed is the fiscal agent of Congress, and they're both creatures of Congress, the Fed and the Treasury. And so it's, the separation is really helps to serve to really more confuse us than anything. If we didn't have a separation between Fed and Treasury, we may have figured this out a little sooner, and it may have been just a lot more simple and clear. But because we have this one step removed, the Treasury then says, oh, see, I'm issuing bonds, and so I have to get the money from the private sector first. I'm borrowing from the private sector in order to spend, and I have to pay whatever interest, those creditors, those wealthy loaners are demanding. But that's not the case. The Fed is not paying an interest rate set by the market who's lending the federal government money. Number one, the Fed always sets the interest rate. Maybe the Fed wouldn't exactly put it that way. They would say they have control over the short-term interest rate, but maybe they don't have control over the long-term, but that's complicated. We know they could. But at root, the thing to understand is the Fed sets the basic interest rate voluntarily. And then the key is the Treasury. It's basically like moving when the government sells bonds, instead of borrowing money, it's just transferring the money that it spent that's sitting in your checking account and now moving that to, let's say, a savings account, which we can call a Treasury bond that pays interest. Like we know our savings accounts now could pay 5% interest thanks to the Fed. So our savings accounts now are paying 5% interest, and that's basically what a Treasury bond is. Does the government have to sell Treasury bonds financially in order to borrow in order to spend? No, it spent the money first. It voluntarily transferred that money, that cash, into a savings account. So it just could skip that second step and just say, here, we've already deficit spent. The spending has already happened. Whether you hold it in a checking account or a savings account is not really relevant, doesn't have much of an impact on inflation. Some people will say, economists would say this is this is monetarily financing the debt if you're just allowing the Fed to print money basically instead of bonds. But MMT is saying, no, it's not different in its inflationary impact and the impact of the spending, whether people end up holding those dollars, those excess dollars that are an accounting, figure, whether those are held as checking or savings, it doesn't really matter. They're still assets of the private sector. They can still be used, and there's still wealth, there's still lent, people can leverage those for more lending, what have you. And spending, and it's kind of irrelevant how folks are saving that money because they're going to spend as much as they're going to spend. It's kind of irrelevant how they're saving the money. And so again, this is probably something that Stephanie Kelton and Randy Ray would all be better at explaining. So this is a lot of the nitty gritty, but and as a normal person trying to wrap my head around this, I think it's very important to understand that it's basically just a vestige. It's just a voluntary choice today that the Treasury and Congress continue to issue bonds when they really don't have to. It really and then what Stephanie says is, if we did that, this is a debate in MMT. Should we just do that? Should we just stop, just advise the Treasury, stop issuing bonds, you don't need to, and then this thing we call the national debt would disappear. It wouldn't exist. So we wouldn't have this, this confusing thing called the national debt that we have to debate about what it is. Is it terrible? Is it a burden on our grandchildren? There would still be deficit spending. There would still be a deficit. There would still be a liability on the Fed's balance sheet, but we wouldn't have this thing called the national debt and the debt clock in New York City. So,
yeah, it's a game changer right there.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you want to mention the name of the economist you talked to in the film, a very well-known economist in the film, who, when you asked the same question too about why does the government borrow, why does it create bonds, he was totally befuddled by this.
Yeah. I do think it's a very important scene in the film, and so I encourage people to go watch the film to see it. It's about 10 minutes in. But for me, it's really an educational moment because I was, I really was genuinely very curious to understand why mainstream economists say what they say and why they say the debt is a danger to our grandchildren and our future. And so, and in my asking as many mainstream economists as I could, I was always setting out. I started as fairly skeptical of MMT as well, and so I certainly wanted to try to understand it myself in order to say, I don't, of course we don't want to be kind of spreading some, dangerous or or conspiratorial ideas if we don't need to. And so I think I went to speak to as many mainstream economists as I could to understand what is their critique of MMT, just simply where does it go wrong? Where does it go wrong? And just point me to what they say and why it's wrong. But I just couldn't quite get anyone to get there. And so the best I could do was kind of try to understand why they're almost talking past each other or not on the same, they're not coming from the same starting point. So it's like, how can we start from the same assumptions in a way? And so for me, that's why I focus a fair bit in the film on the story of money and the nature of money itself, because when I talk to mainstream economists today, another question I asked the same economist was, just what is money? Where does it come from? And I think he kind of ended that quote by saying, just don't think too hard about it, because otherwise you'll be, you'll kind of lose the thread. And that was very interesting for me as well, saying, yeah, if you do think too much about it, you're not able to go along with what's said in the mainstream textbooks. You have to force yourself to not think. You have to force yourself to kind of hold these contradictory ideas, which many economists seem to be able to hold, is these contradictory ideas about what is money and where does it come from, if you don't think too hard about it. But if you do, and you start trying to trace it back, you do come up with some different answers. And I think they're very clarifying and very rewarding if you can get there. But the main point is, I think that it's really the story we tell about the nature of money, what it is, where it comes from. Is it inherently, I think that what's the assumption, what's implied by all the mainstream textbooks, economics textbooks, it's implied that money starts and is originated by the private market. That first we had this system, this natural system called barter. It was a private market system. The market existed first. People just naturally started trucking and bartering, and they had to invent money as this means of making that barter and that trade simpler, to solve the double coincidence of wants, they call it. And so that's a very strong story. It's a simple story. It's told in every economics textbook. The only problem is, there's no proof of that we can find in the historical literature, anthropological, sociological. You ask any of those professions, and they can't ever point you to a specific time and place where a barter system existed, and that barter system invented money. And then later, a government came along and had to tax that money and use it for its own purposes. That's really the order of the story that the mainstream textbook wants to tell. And I think that's very important. It's that root story that everything is built upon. Does money come from the private market, or does it come from government? And in whatever kind of way you want to call government, I think there's many different levels and styles, but inherently, a powerful political institution, be that a temple or a king or a monarch, or a smaller system, a larger system, we can find it originating there in the historical literature, and then through time, first you have the development of a type of taxation and money as a tool for making that taxation and that movement and that production and distribution of resources. Money is invented really more as a tool for helping a society move those around. And then much later, do you kind of get a market. Only once money is invented and it's enabled to be enforced, and we have laws and enforcing private property and what have you that you kind of need in order to have a market. Only then do we see markets develop, and they're after the invention of money. And so if government, if some kind of political force is really at the bottom of all of this, that's where we need to be looking for where how we should be organizing our economy today, and where we should be looking to say, if we want to solve economic problems, maybe we shouldn't necessarily be saying this is a market, we need to solve climate change through the private market. Maybe that's not, the locus of power in an economy even. Maybe we're cutting government short on the ability and the power that it has to solve economic problems. I think we have a tendency to really just kind of say government bad, market good. And I think that's the ideology of mainstream economists. And I think it goes back to this very fundamental, simple story of barter for some reason. And this idea that money is gold, something you dig out from the ground. But when you start to think about that, you start to think about, why would a society, you know, if you just do this little thought experiment, you know, why would a society choose to say it can't do anything unless it finds this shiny rock in the ground? Now, it doesn't need that shiny rock in order to do that thing. So let's say, yeah, the society, they have all these doctors and nurses, and they really want to, you know, they have a health problem, and they really want to train doctors and nurses to help people. And so they need to build hospitals, they need to build schools, they need to train nurses and doctors. And so they need to do all those things. In none of those instances is gold needed in the process. Let's say maybe if as a tooth filler, maybe, okay, you might have to go out and find some gold then. But you know, if a society has the real resources, has the know-how to solve these, you know, this healthcare problem within its society, but it says, oh, wait, no, we don't have that shiny rock that we need to dig out of the ground over here and put it back in the ground, you know, cause all this environmental damage and then put it back under the ground in Fort Knox. Unless we do that process, then we can't train doctors and nurses. Sorry. You know, it's like, what kind of a story is that? And, you know, it's very easy for us to think we want money to be real. We want it to be tangible. We want it to have value in and of itself. We don't like it being, you know, paper. We think, oh, it's worthless. You know, it could just disappear and poof tomorrow. It's true. But if our government disappeared and went poof tomorrow, then your money probably would too. I wouldn't expect, you know, the US dollar to exist beyond the existence of the United States. And so, you know, I think there's this idea that gold, or, you know, there's some market system of money that's just natural and can supersede governments. And that's why Moore Moser doesn't like to use the word money, because it makes it seem like an international kind of phenomenon, or natural phenomenon, when it just isn't on a societal level. But there's a lot to break down there. So I'm not really doing it justice today. I'm a little bit.
Well, you're talking about a lot of stuff, and it's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
You talk about how the government doesn't actually have to issue the bonds. What about taxes? So how do taxes fit into it? You know, I mean, when we talk about the debt, the standard theory is that we need to spend less and tax more. And of course, we know that we give tax breaks to the rich and we tax the poor people more. But what about taxes, and how does that figure in? If the government can issue its own money, and you know, why do we have to tax, and why do we have to raise taxes?
Exactly. Yeah. So another great question. And one we kind of try to address head on in the film with one of our chapter headings, is basically that. And it's, you know, so what is the purpose of taxes? Like, if the government can just print money, then why doesn't it just give us a bunch of money, and not tax us? Well, taxes are really, in the film, we kind of get to this. I like to envision them as almost the engine and the motor of the whole monetary economy. So taxes are really important. And when you look at the order of things, let's say you want to go back to the beginning, you're starting a new society, let's say, and Warren, you know, sometimes they'll give examples of, let's say, it's the U.S. colonies, or any theoretical colonial nation. What comes first, rather than the government just printing money and saying, hey, you know, let's say there's a colonial force coming into this nation. It says, we need to build some roads, we need to build some forts, we need to do some work, we need to hire some soldiers, that sort of thing. Or we want people to work on a plantation, produce something. So they say, here, we're gonna pay you $10 an hour to do this work, and that we need done. We need people to build roads. We need you guys to do all this stuff. And they're like, you know, what are dollars, and why do I need them? So they don't really want to accept money in exchange for labor. Now, then the government says, oh, okay, oh, right. First, I have to tax you. I have to say, you actually owe me a tax of $100 a month, or what have you, in order to live here, in order to be a part of this society, let's say. However, they might, if it's a democracy, they can collectively decide what they want, you know, their tax rate to be, basically, or in a monarchy, or a different kind of situation that's not democratically decided, that's imposed through very coercive, you know, force. But taxes are that thing that once you put a tax on a population, and everyone, or enough people, need that thing in order to pay that tax in order to live, then all of a sudden there is a demand for that thing, whatever it is, whatever form it takes. It doesn't have to take any physical form. It can just be a ledger. It says, okay, you've paid your credit, you've paid your tax. now you're good for another month or another year. And so it can take a physical form. It doesn't have to. It can be paper, it can be print, it can be a token on a gold coin, it can be whatever kind of token. The important thing is the tax liability actually comes first. You have to tax a population before they need the money, and then they need the money, and then they're willing to work for you to earn the money. And then at the end of the year, they pay the taxes back. So in that point, you know, if you trace the credits and the debits, you start seeing what's happening. And I try to flesh that out a bit more in the film, and visually remembering the credits and the debits, the minuses and the pluses. And so the thing to recognize is that taxes are very important to really get a population to start working and to start producing
It sounds
surplus.
like you're saying they're an incentive.
Yeah, I mean, and they're coercive, like, don't get me wrong, they're coercive, or, you know, but it depends on your system. So in the film, you know, I kind of made this silly little scene. It's kind of weird, but it's about, you know, imagine a kind of community or collective community, almost like a hippie commune or something, let's say. And they all want to come together, and they all say, you know, we all need to do collective chores, right? In order to thrive and for our little community to function well. We need to grow a garden, we need to cook, we need to clean, we need to babysit, we need to do these different things. And we'll say, okay, everyone has to do 10 hours of chores per week. Now that chore system, you know, kind of thinking of taxes as chores, or taxes as, you know, you do have to contribute in a society in a way. We're all contributing.
Community service.
Yeah, community service. And so yeah, there's even an example with UMKC, Buckaroo. They created a currency based on community service, you know, requirements. And so if you think about, yeah, anything like that, like a chore, taxes are doing your chores, and you have to do a certain amount in order to be a part of that society. And so if you start assigning, then you could say, okay, well, the chore credit is the liability, or the IOU of the issuer, of that center of the commune. The government or the community center of this commune says, okay, everyone has to pay a chore, but now instead of, I could just keep track on a ledger when everyone's done their chores, or we could create if it's more complicated, if the system's starting to get bigger and bigger, you know, maybe we create this credit system. And so it's a credit that if you hold 10 credits against the center of the community, however many, you know, credits have been issued out, that's recorded as a liability of the center, the government, and anyone who's holding it, it's a chore credit for them. So anytime they need to pay taxes, they can bring it back to the center. But that means it's now transferable. So you can buy things from other people in the community, because everyone starts needing these tax credits. Everyone needs them to pay their taxes, so they're willing to exchange different things for them. So you start to get a market in a way, or what have you. But they become transferable, but we see that the tax is kind of, it's the chore, it's the motor that kind of gets the whole economy going to begin with, and gets a monetary system going to begin with. Because without the tax, that money wouldn't have value. It would be just a piece of paper, you know, an IOU of someone that doesn't have any power to enforce their IOU, basically. And so you have to have that political power first in order to create the system, and then the taxes. And so the taxes, what they say, taxes drive currency. Taxes drive, you know, the currency. And without taxes, if you all of a sudden stop taxing your population, that's probably a bad idea, and you know, your money will basically lose value, or lose all of its value. As happened in different times. But you know, maybe the Confederacy in the U.S. was a good example of that. But so
at one point that taxing the rich isn't so much about paying off the deficit as it is to prevent an oligarchy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. The
So then you
concentration
can,
of wealth in a few people.
Yeah. Then you can start thinking about, well, what are we taxing, and who are we taxing, and why are we taxing what we are? You know, because you need a certain amount of broad-based tax in order to get, you know, drive the currency. You need a broad-based tax. You need enough people to kind of need the money, as they say. But you don't, you know, you can start looking at it much more as a, you know, an egalitarian issue. It's an issue of democracy. So how come, you know, do the wealthy really need so much? Because when we start thinking about what we can afford in terms of climate change, we have a tendency to look at, oh, there's the rich, that's where the money is. We have to get it from them in order to do this important thing like feed a child or solve climate change. You know, it's like, oh, first we have to get it from them. But MMT is saying, well, we can disconnect those fights a little bit and say, you know, we still have the capacity as a society to care for people, you know, to feed a hungry child and to clean up the environment, different things. You know, we don't need the rich people's money. That kind of puts the government in the kind of, right, this weak position of saying we need the rich people's money. That's where the money comes from. You know, we're very dependent on that kind of economic growth to generate money that we can then use a little bit of that for some good over here. But like, if that's not the way the system quite works, then it's like, you know, they're kind of accumulating too much over here. We need to bring that down, not because we need their money, you know, not because we're actually going to take that and spend it over here, but, you know, when you'll see with the accounting, once you collect the taxes, that money is effectively destroyed, right? So the money's created when it's spent, and when it's taxed back, it's destroyed in the same process of coming out of thin air and going back to thin air. And so, you know, we can't actually use the rich people's money to pay for things. It would be physically impossible, because those dollars are deleted when they're collected as taxes. So once we see that, it's like, well, okay, we still want to tax the rich, and maybe we should tax them a lot more than we were going to, just to pay for this, just to pay to feed a hungry kid. Maybe we should tax them a lot more because, you know, because they're getting so much political power, they're able to buy off politicians, create an oligarchy. You know, maybe that's a problem for democracy. So yeah, we really want to think about what are taxes for? What are we taxing? Do we need to tax good things we want to encourage, like someone earning income? Maybe we don't need such a high income tax. Maybe we could have a different kind of tax that's broad-based. So some people propose something more like a property tax or cubic footage tax that could be kind of more that basic tax rather than an income tax. So all of a sudden it starts opening doors to what are we taxing? Why are we taxing it? And always remembering that those dollars are deleted. So think about, you know, where are you trying to kind of pull to, you know, where are you trying to pull those credits from, and where are you trying to inject those credits into, when you're spending and taxing. It's not about getting money to spend, it's about injections and returns in a way.
And that's a really kind of a mind-blowing, mind-bending aspect in the film that's talked about a few times, and what you've just said, Maren, too, about the government destroying the revenue they get from taxes, because we're all, like Stephanie Kelton in her book, The Deficit Myth, right from the beginning, said that even though the government's budget shouldn't be what we take, we figure out what we're going to get from taxes and borrowing, and then we figure out how much we spend. The real model is spending, and then you see what you get in taxes and borrowing. But in the film, as it's talked about, the money, and as you said, Maren, the money is just destroyed. So the money isn't even used. The revenue from taxes that the government takes in is not then put in the till at all. That's which is
yeah. And why is that? Why is the money destroyed? That was the kind of mind-blowing thing to me in the film that I couldn't quite wrap my head around. Like if you borrow from me, you know, if you borrow from me and you pay me back, I'm not going to rip up the $10 you just paid back to me.
Right. Yeah. So that's good. Yeah. So you're starting to think about, so again, it's this accounting ledger. So I'm trying to always visualize it as the plus and the minus, who has the plus, who has the minus. Thinking about it, let's say thinking about it, we can instead of the government, you know, I have an example of what we call bank money, which is a whole nother layer, right? Like banks create money too. So when you take out a loan to borrow a house, to buy a house, the bank is effectively creating money at that point when you sign your loan. And so let's say the house is $50,000. But if your loan is $50,000, the bank has effectively created, there's two sides of each. There's actually, each person has a two-sided balance sheet, what they call a T account, let's say. But and there's probably a better way for me to explain this visually, but when you think about the IOU is created, the credit, let's go back to the federal government. So why your taxes are destroyed? It's because when the government deficit spends, it's creating a liability, a minus. So it's sitting on its side of the balance sheet. And when so it's, you know, it spends 100 into the economy, it taxes 90 back out. So those, yeah, it's at that point, those 90 are deleted, right? And you have 10 left. And so basically it's, you know, when you think about, first there's minus 100 and plus 100, then 90 of those come back. So then you're down to 10. So it is, you know, it's kind of going back to that commune scene of why is the money deleted? It's because, once it's an IOU, so it's a liability, and once the liability comes back, once it's paid off, the numbers on the balance sheet just go back down. So it's like the numbers grow as it spends. The more the deficit spending occurs, it goes from 90 to 100. But then when the taxes come back, those numbers just go back down towards zero, but maybe not completely to zero, because then we'd be running a surplus. But anyway, so it's really numbers go up, numbers go down. That's what's happening when you're taxing. It's just like this constant churn of numbers going up and numbers going down in the spreadsheet, or on this ledger. And that's because it's the government's IOU. It's their liability. Let's say so you were giving the example of if you lend someone something. Well, let's say, I do borrow a cup of sugar from you, and so I give you my IOU, and I say I owe you a cup of sugar. So you're holding my debt, basically. I have a debt now, you have an asset that says you're owed a cup of sugar and I owe a cup of sugar. Let's say next week I come back, I give you the cup of sugar that you're owed, I take back my IOU, I tear it up and throw it away, because I don't, if I'm my IOU that says I owe you something, once I take it back, I don't, it's not worth anything to me. It's my IOU. It's my IOU. It's now that relationship, that process is now complete. It's come back, tear it up, throw it away. That was a relationship. It's now been completed. The plus and the minus have met back together, and they've canceled each other, basically. And so when anyone receives back their own IOU, it's not an asset to them, if that makes any sense. So when the government, the dollar is an IOU of the government, it's a tax credit for us. So when anyone who holds a dollar has a tax credit, they can use to pay their taxes. When they return it to the government, they no longer have the credit, and the government no longer has the liability. They now are fulfilling their side of the bargain, which says, I owe you the responsibility to reduce your tax obligation, basically, when you pay your taxes. Now you have less tax obligation, and the government has less credits outstanding. So their number goes back down of how many liabilities, how many IOUs they have outstanding when those dollars come back, because their responsibility is to accept the dollars back in payment of your taxes and to lower your what you owe. So everyone has their two-sided, what they owe and what they're owed. And so, sorry, I can't, it would be easier if I could visually draw this out or take some time.
Well, you do it visually in the movie. So
yeah.
in the film, you actually, when you can see it visually, it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, but I don't know if that made any sense. It's like you kind of go in circles, but I think that's a big one. I mean, that's a good question, and one I struggle with understanding for a while too. It's like, wait, why are the dollars destroyed? Why are they deleted? And it goes back to the accounting as the liabilities and the assets, and you just always focus on those those balance sheets. They have to balance.
And yet those dollars that I pay to the bank for my mortgage, those are hard-earned dollars on my part that I do labor for and sell things. Right. That's my income that I give to the bank. I mean, it's horrible to think I do all that work and they just destroy it. Yeah,
basically. Yeah, they do. And then they get to keep the interest, all the interest. So that's a whole nother story is, what are banks really, and why do they have so much, I think, in the film, we even get to say a little bit that, banks, I think a lot of people think of banks as more like almost franchises of the federal government or of the Federal Reserve System. And so they're really in a lot of ways extending public credit when they're creating money. They're not lending money that someone else worked really hard to borrow up and save, and they're lending it out, and they can lend it to whoever they want because that's their money, that's their private money. So no, not exactly. Like they're creating new money. They're basically extending credit thanks to the power that the federal government has given them through a bank charter. It's the federal government, it's the Fed standing behind them that allows them to issue that credit. And all the banks are doing are basically just running credit checks. That's their only purpose, is to run a credit check, decide whether you can pay back this loan if they think you'll pay back the loan, and then they can reap the reward of whatever the Fed sets the interest rate at, and they go above that to get their profit on the mortgage. But are they doing so much work for it? Not in my opinion. And are they, should they get to choose who gets lending and who doesn't? In a lot of ways, I think that could be a lot more democratized. And I think there's a big movement for more public banking. there could be a lot more regulation on private banks of who they're lending to. You know, should private banks be lending billions and billions of dollars towards new fossil fuel infrastructure pipelines that, you know, are maybe not a good investment for our society, that are going to be stranded assets, a huge amount of resources going into this infrastructure, because in their calculation they're going to make a buck off it. But you know, is that their choice to make? Is that really their choice to make? Because they're really if they're extending public credit rather than, you know, this kind of their own money that they get to decide what to do with. You know, I think that changes the debate a little bit when you think about whose money is it.
Mhm.
And as is said in the film, at the very end of the film, I forgot which of the economists, the MMT economists, said that, but they said that money should be a public utility. And you have the segment in the film with his name Delman Coates, is that name? With the organization Our Money, you know, talking about the same thing, that, you know, this is, again, money should be a public good. You know, banks create, and I'm glad that you went into, you know, had the whole segment in the film about banks. Banks create 97% of the money in circulation is created by banks, and they can do what they want. And as you said, Maren, most of that money goes to fossil fuel companies, or, you know, just things that are not benefiting humanity. And they need
Yeah.
to be in many ways.
Yeah, and especially if we're thinking about inflation too, you know, it's an important tool there to say, you know, is it really different for the, you know, we're worried about the federal government spending money and causing inflation. Maybe we should also be worried about private banks creating money and causing inflation, especially on fossil fuel infrastructure projects, or, you know, things of this nature, you know, that are not only you know, have inflationary potential, but are damaging in other ways. So I think there's a lot of work that could be done there. And it really important work to say, hey, like, let's look at this spending too, if we want to be, if we're serious about preventing inflation and lowering inflation, if we have it. I think that's a really important place to look. And, you know, Nathan Tinkus is a great MMT writer, and he has a great paper out on what he calls, you know, these kind of, I'm forgetting the name, but it's like, you know, non-fiscal monetary tool, something, I don't know, but it's basically saying, you know, the Fed, through its regulatory oversight of banks, has a lot of possibility there to actually do some work on inflation through bank lending policy, and creating qualitative and other type of regulatory functions. Or, you know, I think inherently it needs to be more democratically decided of, you know, where credit should be going. But there's a lot of room there to say, you know, point out where there's inflationary potential from this private money creation, that's really allowed, you know, it's really funded by the public at the end when you get back, you know, if you trace it basically all the way back. So yeah, if that makes any sense, it's again, it's back to inflation, and we can use a lot more tools to tackle it than we are today with just the interest rate, and somehow we're skating by. Yeah, but that's a whole nother debate.
Yeah. So we got some questions.
Yeah.
Our questions and comments. Early on, Patricia had commented when I said, I think we were on camera when I said, the film Finding the Money, Maren, should be required watching for Economics 101. And Patricia commented, how about Living 101? I thought that was very apt. And then Georgia asked, and this is a really important question, or a comment, when it comes to the military requests or money for war, no one ever asks where the money is going to come from, because they know the U.S. Treasury will just issue it. And that's
yeah. So it's often proof, right? It's, you know, so it just kind of shows, oftentimes Congress members do understand that they have the power to create money when it comes down to something that they see as really essential, right? Or during COVID, no one really asked where that money was coming from, and who was, you know, how were they going to borrow and tax to afford $5 trillion of new spending that happened during COVID, you know? That was all created new money. But, and we should be thinking about the inflationary impacts of that. And I think you can break down, you know, maybe if there was some inflationary impact from that spending, that's a good debate to be having, and how we could have done that better, maybe more precisely, and so forth. But anyway, it's never like a typical one-to-one spending versus inflation. It's much more complicated than that. But yeah, to the point, which was I'm trying to remember now.
the Treasury can just create money.
Yeah.
I follow
Yeah.
Stephanie Pelton on Twitter and I subscribe to her Substack, and she talks about this a lot on Twitter. Since you just say short thing, she has said, "Oh, they've had no problem finding the money," like as Georgia points out, for war.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's all it all. Then at that point, once we understand how the system works, then we really just have to hold our democratic representatives accountable, because it all comes down to where do we want the funding to really go? And if we really wanted to go to war, then I guess that's democracy. But if we think there are some other priorities or that would be much more efficient, a much more efficient use of real resources than creating tons of bombs that go destroy, just to destroy other people's lives and infrastructure and, terrible thing. Like this is maybe not an use of resources when we could be using it to build and improve society rather than destroy society. So yeah, I think we should be having that debate, not about whether we can afford it or not, is a different question. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So, and Veronica asked, "When can we see the film?" We haven't even asked that question. So
Yeah, yeah, I
when,
should
when will
put,
it be, you think, available to see?
yeah, I should put that up front. But yeah, so our website is findingmoneyfilm.com, www.findingmoneyfilm.com. And so we'll have more screening info on there. We're screening through the spring, and we just signed with the distributor. So we're figuring all this out right now, but it looks like we are aiming for a theatrical release, a limited theatrical release in the beginning of May. So we did really want to hit this kind of election year where hopefully this kind of subject matter will be more in the public conversation. And so I think we'll have, if you want to organize, a screening in your town or community, we're also very open to, educational campus screenings through the spring, community screenings. So you can go to our website, which is findingmoneyfilm.com, and there's a host a screening tab where you can fill out if you'd like to host a screening or find out more about where to watch it. We're going to update. There's some exciting screenings happening. We're going to have a big tour actually in Australia at the beginning of March. Stephanie and I will be down there for several city tour in Australia that some folks are organizing, some great folks at Modern Money Lab. And so we'll be down there and then maybe in Europe and then back in the US. And so so there will be opportunities to watch, but if you feel inspired to organize a screening, that's what we really depend on is, this kind of grassroots spreading by word of mouth. Tell your friend to watch the film. So so once it's really out there, we really want to make a big splash with some, headline events and hopefully get into the public conversation in the beginning of May, before it's too late, before it's kind of hitting, we're a little late maybe on the election cycle, but what have you. So I think it'll be out in theaters for a little bit and then available to rent wherever you rent movies. So definitely it'll be so important to share once we're on all those rental platforms like iTunes, Google Play, Amazon. Once we're on there, certainly that'll be so important for folks if they can to go out and drop the $5 on a movie rental.
Yeah.
So
Veronica says it would be interesting to see Bernie Sanders' take on this, but Bernie Sanders actually wanted Stephanie Kelton to be his economic advisor and brought her on the team. Isn't that correct?
Right. So she was his chief economist on the budget committee in 2015-16, and then was a economic advisor for his 2 presidential campaigns. And so yeah, so they're very close, but it is interesting, and I think I don't know the full story of how much he's kind of absorbed the MMT thinking or language, or how much he feels comfortable saying it publicly. So I think that's an interesting topic of conversation is, can politicians come out and say stuff like this, like, oh, actually, your tax dollars are destroyed when we collect them. Like he's going to be laughed off the stage, right? So I think, it's hard for Bernie or any politician to come out first and say, start trying to explain this, especially when the mainstream economists would say, you're crazy, what are you talking about? So so it's an interesting dilemma where I think hopefully this story, may need to come more from the grassroots and more from us, so that we're kind of demanding the truth from politicians, or once, maybe if Stephanie is successful in getting the word out a little more about this information, that then a politician could go in front of an audience and say, we're going to pay for the Green New Deal by here's how we're going to resource the Green New Deal, and here's where we're going to get this many, solar workers, or this many, trains and buses, and this, here's how we're going to resource it all, and start talking about it that way instead of where's the money going to come from. So hopefully that'll be up to us to kind of hold our politicians accountable. So we'll see if we can get there and change the conversation a little bit.
Yeah, you do have a clip in the film, I think towards the end, where you show Bernie Sanders saying we need to go back to, or we need to recreate the New Deal policies. And I think that was right after the clip from FDR in 1945, a month or a couple months before he died, talking about the Second Bill of Rights. So, they weren't necessarily MMT, which wasn't around then, but it was kind of Keynesian, John Maynard Keynesian influenced ideas for FDR. But it's in that ballpark of government deficit spending to create a society, broad-based society that works for all.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's maybe a great vision. It's like, what is your vision? You first have to start with a vision, and then how do you, how can you use money as the organizing tool to achieve that vision successfully without causing inflation and while, bringing everyone along. And so I think this, having that vision that says we can do this, and money is the organizing tool that we understand that we humans have created in order to help us do this, it changes the conversation. But yeah, like the important thing is coming together around a vision like that we could have, as FDR says, decent healthcare for all and housing for all, and he says Medicare for all, housing, guaranteed jobs, and all of these things are, those things were, he proposed those right after the Great Depression, when we seemed to be so poor and so destitute and so, at our lowest almost, like we could have accomplished those things. We could have always accomplished these things. And so I think we almost did back then. I think with a little shift in history, we would have gone even more down that path. But it's important to have even just the vision of what's possible. I think what economics often serves to do is constrain our vision of what's possible and just not even let us think that we could have something better, that it's just not affordable, just so don't even think about it. But I think if we can envision that better future, then we have a chance of figuring out the organizational facets of getting there. So yeah.
So Veronica asked, Patricia asked about recommending any easy to understand books before the film comes out. I would recommend Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. I don't know if you, Maren, you have any other books you would recommend, but Stephanie Kelton's book is great and really, goes into it in detail.
Yeah, definitely. I would start there, The Deficit Myth. And then I do have on the website, if you go there again, the findingmoneyfilm.com, there's a little resources tab where we list some more books, and we'll continue to add to that, add more resources, because there's a lot. If you start going down this rabbit hole, there's a lot of great books. So we list a few, and then a lot of great, intellectual thinkers on this. And so great videos, podcasts, you can kind of get lost for a while if you want to. So be careful.
Yeah. We still have a few more questions.
Okay.
I know you were.
We'll power through some.
Okay. See, Veronica asked, she's curious about why economies fail. Our stock market crashed, Germany's crash before the rise of Hitler, Japanese yen, Greece's debt. Is there a common denominator?
Good question. Yeah. And I think the important thing is there isn't always a common denominator. You always have to look at the specifics of the situation, the historical, significance where they, what's happening where they are. And so, you could analyze Weimar Germany, why that kind of hyperinflation happened. Maybe I won't get into it now, but there's always certain causes, right? And it's not just a blanket, oh, the government printed too much money and that is what causes hyperinflation. There's never really they've never shown an example of that being the case, where it's just, oh, the government decides to print a bunch of money and it causes hyperinflation. There's usually problems on the supply side, right? And so let's say Weimar Germany, I'll just briefly say, their infrastructure was gutted, in World War I, so much of their capacity was diminished. And then they were also told they need to produce so much to export, to get foreign exchange, to pay off their reparations that were put on them from after World War I. And so they had huge external debt that they have to pay, not in their own currency, but in an external foreign currency, basically. So they basically had to produce and export way more than they could produce and export and feed their population at the same time. So they were in a fundamental problem that wasn't going to be solved. Something was going to have to give. So So the printing of money, in that situation was really a causal effect of just trying to survive, with just trying to have their population survive through that period. And so that eventually, had to break down if you just can't produce enough to from this imposition from World War I. So so there's kind of that. And then Venezuela, you can look at what are the historical colonial facets of that, and then the oil comes in and the embargo comes in, and it basically comes down to a supply shock. Supply that they just didn't have food, basically. It's a very important thing in an economy. And so yeah, I can't go into too many specifics, but it's always like, look at the specifics of what's causing the historical significance of each episode you might be thinking of. And there's good information out there, especially from the scholars that are featured in this film. But it is hard to wade through, because it's all there's always folks saying different things. So I know, yeah, there's a lot out there, especially a lot of, I think, worry, the 2008 financial crisis. What caused that? Oh, like no one saw that coming. Well, I mean, a lot of the MMT economists did see that coming, because they were seeing the sector balance graph, which is featured in the film, that the government was running surpluses for a while in the Clinton era, which means they were pulling savings out of the private sector. And then so in order to keep going at the same rate they were, or to stay, the same, the private sector was starting to borrow a ton more, just to kind of stay afloat, borrowers to stay afloat. And then, of course, there was tons of fraud, in the housing sector, and that exploded. It was a real regulatory failure in that aspect of, banks lending very fraudulently in that era. So a couple of things combining, but you can see what happened, and you can see what our solutions were and how our solutions at the time did not work. All the Fed cut interest rates, they did QE, but none of that was enough to fill the hole that was left in spending. Where it's almost like it's similar to the Depression. There's a hole in spending, basically, and the only person that can come in at that point and spend is the federal government. And the federal government at the time wasn't willing to spend. During the Obama era, we had the Tea Party. We had everyone starting to freak out about the national debt at precisely the time, when the federal government could have spent more than ever before, because we had so much underutilized capacity, so many factories empty, so many unemployed workers that could have been hired by the federal government to do important work, to do important climate work. And instead, the government's sitting there saying, oh, look, the debt's increasing. And that was simply a product of people being so unemployed, that budget's going to that deficit spending is going to automatically go up. But that's a point where that's where you really see the difference between MMT and mainstream economists' advice, political, economic advice. The mainstream economists are saying we have to tighten our belts just like everyone else. We have to rein in deficit spending, just like you and your household have to rein in your spending. Well, that's kind of the opposite of what you want to be doing. And so, in Jason Furman in the film, he says, let's say, let's accept the MMT premise that deficit spending causes inflation, or the main thing is he really proposed that we cut the deficit during a time of recession, a great recession, which is a time when it wouldn't be necessarily inflationary to spend a lot of money, even though the size of the debt was growing. That was kind of irrelevant, because there was so much capacity open for room for government spending without causing inflation, that's when it really matters what you're looking at. If you're looking at inflation as the limit, or if you're looking at a simple number of deficits and debt as the limit, then yeah, it starts really shifting. So I think the deep Greek debt crisis is similar in that a lot of these terrible crises are basically unnecessary. The Great Depression, the Great Recession, Greek debt crisis, all of these things are very much politically created problems, and really coming from a misunderstanding of the monetary system, I think, which is interesting, and yeah, something to really delve into more.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing about Germany, and a lesson that could be applied now, but it's not. The difference between post-World War I and post-World War II with Germany was, post-World War I, Germany was expected to pay back all the war debts. As he pointed out, Maren, the economy was devastated, and it led to a demagogue rising up, Hitler, who said he'd make Germany great again. Post-World War II, Germany was given a debt jubilee and given debt forgiveness for I think 90% of their debt. You know, we could have done the same thing in the 2008 crash for individuals. We gave it for banks.
Yeah.
We could do that for student loans now. We could do a lot of debt forgiveness or debt jubilees. David Graeber has written a lot about that subject. So yeah, so it really is the temperament and who are we, you know, is money a public utility, as we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So yeah, you start thinking about it very differently. Yeah. So I think depression, depressions are really a good place to look where the difference between if money were gold and the government did have to go out and find it in order to spend it, it's a very different scenario in the Great Depression when, you have the same number of people in your society. We had the booming 20s, right? Or the roaring 20s. You're doing all this, all of a sudden a stock market crashes and a depression hits, and all of a sudden you can't do anything as a society. It's like all of a sudden we can't farm, we can't feed people, we can't, take care of, have doctors or nurses. That didn't like the capacity of our economy didn't fundamentally change. An asteroid didn't hit, there was
Yeah.
a dust bowl, which was bad, a real environmental disaster. But if the government, basically moral of the story, the government could have spent a lot more. I mean, FDR spent a lot in the New Deal, but he could have spent a lot more even to get all those people employed and producing the society we wanted. And instead, we realized we really needed to spend once we hit World War II. Then that spending really started flowing out, and then everyone was really fully employed. But you know what? All those resources went to destroying another continent and world. So all of that production could have always happened in 1930, instead of 1940s. It could have happened in 1930 during the Depression. We could have produced and utilized so much to maybe build a peaceful, prosperous, sustainably prosperous society at that time, rather than crazy amounts of war spending. So yeah.
So we've had you on for
Yeah.
a long time, Maren. We really thank you. And Grace has a few questions. I think I just want to boil it down to try to distill, because we'd probably go for a lot longer if I asked all Grace's questions. But one I thought of, and that she asked, and sorry, Grace, if I'm not asking everything, but it's something I'm an advocate of, the concept of universal basic income. And Grace asked, and I want to preface it by saying the French economist Thomas Piketty has advocated not only universal basic income, but what does he call it? Universal minimum inheritance, that everybody is given a certain amount of money, about $150,000 at birth, I think payable at a certain age. But Grace asks, could universal basic income be made a reality through the distribution of Treasury bonds to everyone? And I know modern monetary theory does not talk about it, but I just, Grace asked it. We have you here.
So the government could always give us as much money as we wanted, right? So it could credit everyone's account with $100,000 tomorrow. The question is, is that going to be optimal? And what problem are we trying to solve? I think, so it's through universal basic income. I would always ask, what problem are you trying to solve? And then think about the best way to do that. Universal basic income is interesting. I think there's a really interesting conversation there to have, because a lot of times MMT folks are a little more skeptical, especially of universal basic income, like giving the same amount of money to everyone, no conditions, no questions asked. They say that could be problematic in that, let's say, you give everyone that same amount. Number one, could that make inequality worse? Like were you trying to solve inequality? Because that policy could make inequality worse if you think about it, where, if everyone gets the same amount, the rich are able to save it, invest it, the poor are going to spend it, and it doesn't change the power dynamics in an economy. So, the landlords could say, oh, great, you have $10,000 more, rent just went up $10,000, so that could kind of disappear or just be an inflationary impulse and not really shift the dynamics or the distribution of wealth in an economy. So if you give, that could just even make inequality worse, let's say, if you did it a certain way. So I think, MMT economists, they come in all stripes, but most of them are very on board for this idea of a jobs guarantee. So a federal jobs guarantee, where it says you're not just guaranteed cash, but we shouldn't have anyone who's involuntarily unemployed. So anyone who wants a job should be able to get a job in the public interest, doing something that our community deems, necessary and good. And, we can all think of, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think we can all look at our community and say, hey, what if we did this and this and this? Anyone who's unemployed should be able to, I think, find a job in the public for the public good. And that can be matched, the work of Pavlina Chernova is great on this. So, matching people's strengths to what's needed. And there's a lot of work there. And this has been, trialed in different areas. And, the closest we got to it was maybe the WPA in the Great Depression in the US, employing a lot of people. But that would kind of be a basic, that would kind of replace the minimum wage in a way. And there's different ideas of how the job guarantee could work, but it would be the floor. And there's a lot of things where they prefer this because it would be less inflationary, actually. The UBI, they're concerned about inflationary impacts. And so the jobs guarantee, they're looking at it as really something that could actually help stabilize inflation, stabilizes kind of the value of the currency in a lot of ways. It creates what they call this buffer stock of employed people that businesses can pull from when business is good. The private sector, maybe there will be very few people in the jobs guarantee program when business is good. But when a recession hits, it's automatic. People can always fall back on the job guarantee. That deficit spending can increase. And so it's what they call a counter-cyclical, policy where government spending and taxing is automatically going up and down with the needs of the private economy. So you also don't have to worry as much about this question of Congress passing the right legislation at the right time in order to spend and tax kind of at the right time to deal with inflation. Something like the job guarantee would be much more automatic. The spending and the taxing would happen automatically. So there's a couple of reasons why they really like that policy, especially as compared to UBI and but maybe they would look at a basic income for folks who can't work, that sort of thing. But yeah, a lot to discuss there.
Yeah. So sorry, Grace. We've gone long, probably one of the longest we've ever gone. But and the film is brilliant, Maren, and thank you so much for your commitment to making it. I mean, thanks to all the MMT economists and I think your film will really help bring it out even more than Stephanie Kelton's book was probably the most public face yet. So it's going to be really great when it gets out there and people can see it. And
yeah, looking forward to getting it out.
I'll bet.
How long did it take you to make it?
Too long. So started in like 2019. Most of the shooting happened before the pandemic, so the pandemic kind of slowed things down, but we kept chugging through. So yeah, and it was mostly a process of trying to find money that took a while. So
you had to find the money as well. Yeah. Well, I just want to say that if, some of these ideas seem complicated, they're broken down chapter by chapter in the film, and with the, animations that you have and the visual illustrations, it makes it a lot easier to understand. And so, watch for this film, hold a screening in your home or your local library or church community or wherever you can. And I think films are just a great way to spread ideas more rapidly than books. And I think you've done a great job. And thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and especially with the films, like we can have, panel discussions, or if you want, holding a screening is always nice. It's actually a nice film to watch with an audience, I think, and you can kind of react and then you can discuss after.
Yeah, I'll definitely want to organize something in my area. So
great.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and I'm always,
Maren. No, thank you guys so much
for your interview, for your intelligence. Thank you very much. And let's hope this film spreads far and wide.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for listening. And we'll see you next time. The recording will be sent out in a few days. And if you're not on the mailing list and you got here by somebody else, go to voicesforthefuture.org. It is .org, right? Yeah. And you can sign on to our mailing list.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
Thank you.